Hi, welcome to this Physionic study analysis. We're going to be going over 11 different studies to find out if hyaluronic acid, which is an incredibly popular bioactive ingredient in a lot of skin serums and different skincare products, is actually effective. So we're going to be going over a lot of literature, and I'm going to give you a little bit of background on the physiology, what actually hyaluronic acid does to our skin. I've been interested in skincare for a number of years now, and I have my own skincare routine, but frankly, actually figuring out if the ingredients within that skincare routine are actually doing anything or if they're just marketing hype is, to me, incredibly important because I don't want to be wasting my money. So I've done a little bit of investigation to collagen, and now I'm turning my sights onto hyaluronic acid, and then we're going to continue going down and looking at several others as well as time goes on. But if you're not familiar with who I am, my name is Nicholas Verhoeven. I'm a PhD candidate in molecular medicine, and this is what I do. I read studies. I analyze studies down to their nitty-gritty detail, from the good to the bad, and then come out with, hopefully, positive conclusions, some transparent, clear conclusions on what we can do with that information from these studies. And as I mentioned, we're going to be going over 11 different studies for this particular breakdown. So that said, here's what we're going to be going over. We're going to, as I mentioned, go a little bit into hyaluronic acid, but specifically the physiology. So how does hyaluronic acid supposedly help our skin? What does it actually do in our skin? Then we're going to go over topical, so what we apply to our skin, oral, so what we ingest, obviously, and then injectable, which I didn't actually know was a thing, but apparently it is a thing. Injectable hyaluronic acid, which is this abbreviation, and if it's effective at reversing skin aging. So can we stave off skin aging, and can we reverse skin aging? And then for my Physionic Insiders, if you're part of that program, then you'll also get information on the optimal dose and the implementation. And actually what's even more important is the size of the hyaluronic molecule, because that matters quite a bit. And how recommendations change based off of size changes of the molecule itself. But we'll get into that. If you're interested in accessing these 2 points as well, then certainly hop on over to the Physionic Insiders. I'll have a ticker for you, or you can see the ticker down below and join. And you'll get access to this, of course, with all my other study analyses and seminars and live office hours and many other perks. And if you're just interested in just finding out about the physiology and the rest of it, then that's publicly available. Then let's get into it. As usual, I've been trying to stick to this whole idea of showing you the studies and then, of course, showing you the funding behind those studies. So we're going to be going over, as I mentioned, 11 studies. This is 6 of them. On the next slide, I'll show you the other 5. But what you'll notice is that the funding for these studies is heavily slanted towards industry funding. So if you as an individual think that industry funding immediately disqualifies studies, then you'll find that probably about 90% of the studies in this area are going to be disqualified, and you're not going to get any information. So I don't hold that opinion. I just become a little more cautious when it comes to industry funding, but that doesn't necessarily mean that industry funding negates an entire study. But there will be other factors that may negate some of these studies, as we'll get into, and you'll definitely see why, because I'll explain it in quite some detail. Okay, so we've got study 109, so they're all labeled 109, 10, 11, etc. Most of them have industry funding. Simple as that. I couldn't find the funding for study 114, and then for 115 industry, 16 industry, 120. So suspected industry, I forgot exactly why I mentioned suspected industry for this. I think maybe because the researchers, I think the researchers worked at a particular company, and that's why I assumed that the funding was from industry. And finally, this one was the only one that did not receive funding and was done by a university, but it is not an actual primary literature. Or in the terms of, it's not a randomized controlled trial, it's not a trial itself, it's a review. So it's a scientific review of the literature, which of course is going to also be heavily in industry's favor. There may be some studies that I'm missing here that are university, but they're covered in this review. So this is probably the least biased of all of the, or potential bias of all the studies that we're going to be looking at. But still, that doesn't mean that we're not going to get some information out of this. Okay, so the first two studies that we'll be going over are these two. So we've got our more unbiased study, or the review, really, the scientific review, and we've got our more biased, which is also industry funded. All these individuals have some sort of affiliation to some form of industry. And let's get into a little bit of the physiology here. So if we were to zoom in to a cube of our skin, so we zoom into our skin and then we turn that, so we're zooming in and then we flip it to the side by what, 90 degrees, and then we actually look at the thickness of skin, we'd see that there's an outer layer here, which is actually made up of multiple layers, but I only have one labeled, which is the stratum corneum. This stratum corneum is the very layer that we see. So the one that you're actually looking at on me, the one that you see on yourself, is this stratum corneum. And then there's a number of other like stratum, other versions which are just below it. And then there's this other layer, which is incredibly important, called the epidermis. And this is where you'll find some hyaluronic acid located, but we'll get to that. And then we've got the much thicker layer, which is the dermis, and then we've got a hypodermis as well, but I'm just focusing on some of the main components. So what do we find in these layers? Well, in the epidermis, we're finding keratinocytes, which are skin cells. So that's the predominant cell type that's found in the epidermis, which is not the case with the dermis. So the dermis, we find fibroblasts, and we'll see exactly why in just a little bit. In the dermis, we also see considerable amounts of the production of collagen, so which is another structural protein, and elastin. So elastin and collagen work together to create structure to this dermis-epidermis kind of conjunction. So at this point, we have flat skin, we have smooth, silky skin, because this structure is holding up like architecture, like building architecture, holding up the epidermis up top. And the epidermis is also filled with some other structural proteins, but the main ones are found in the dermis. So you have collagen as the main backbone, and then you have elastin that plays as a reinforcement protein on collagen. That's a really basic understanding of these proteins. It's certainly something that I would need to educate myself further on as well. So certainly don't think that I know everything about this. I'm learning as I'm reading through these reviews. So and all this information is coming from these reviews. So it's not just my knowledge, my limited knowledge on skin physiology. It's also coming from what I've read and actually taken notes on from these reviews. And also in the dermis, as I mentioned, is these fibroblasts. And the reason why these fibroblasts are so important is because the fibroblasts actually produce collagen, and they produce elastin, and they produce hyaluronic acid. So they are incredibly important and play a major role in the health of the dermis. And as I mentioned, the dermis also holds hyaluronic acid, or hyaluronin. I'm going to call it hyaluronic acid because that's the most common. So HA, or hyaluronin, hyaluronic acid, is also found in this, and it comes in a variety of different sizes and shapes. So the sizes come as high molecular weight hyaluronic acid or low molecular weight hyaluronic acid, and then you can get some intermediates in between them. And they serve different functions. I'm not going to go into too much detail about the different functions that they serve, but I'll say maybe one thing about each. So the smaller versions of this molecule can bind to the cells, so they can bind to fibroblasts, they can bind to keratinocytes, they can bind to other cells in that region, and they can promote the migration of these cells, meaning you have the movement of, let's say, keratinocytes moving from the deeper recesses of the skin into the epidermis. So they'll move upwards. And some of that is mediated by the hyaluronic acid. So the small versions are binding to receptors, hyaluronic acid receptors on the cells, and then that activates the cells to then actually migrate to different areas of the skin. Okay. So, and they can also activate the cells to grow and to proliferate, to generate more cells. Okay, great. So that's especially useful if you're talking about something like fibroblasts, right? Because fibroblasts produce more hyaluronic acid, collagen, and this elastin. Okay, great. But then there's also these larger versions, or high molecular weight hyaluronic acid, and that acts as more of a structural component of the skin. Again, there are more functions for both of them. I'm just listing just one function. However, one of the primary functions of hyaluronic acid, regardless of the size, is its extreme, and I can't express this enough, extreme love for water. Not that it's sitting there thinking, wow, I really love water, but as a molecule, it is extremely what's known as hydrophilic, meaning that it loves water. And to illustrate that, its volume, so the size or the overall space that it takes up, the hyaluronic acid molecule itself, it can take up over 1,000 times that level in water. It attracts over 1,000 times that amount of water to the molecule. And which means that hyaluronic acid is the premier molecule for hydrating the skin. And that can have effects just outside of the skin, as we'll discuss later, as well as inside the skin. But inside the skin, it plays an extremely powerful role because it plumps up the skin, supposedly, as we'll see, maybe. And hyaluronic acid, when it's found inside, so let's say your fibroblasts are producing hyaluronic acid, it attracts a bunch of water, then that structure that is being held up by collagen and elastin, whatever space is found in there can be filled in with hyaluronic acid and water, which then overall keeps this surface of the skin flat, because not only is it being held up by collagen and elastin, it's also being held up by hyaluronic acid, and it's being held up by the sheer amount of water in that region. So that's what creates that kind of plumpness. So if you were to pull on it, pull on your skin, and it snaps back to its position, it might have a little bit of a jiggle and whatnot. That's healthy skin. That's what you want. That's from that water content. Okay, so what happens when we get older? When we get older, or if we just do damage to our skin, it doesn't necessarily have to be because we're older. It can be through intrinsic and extrinsic factors that lead to skin damage or skin aging, I suppose, in a way you could call it that. So intrinsic factors would be like the aging process, so greater reactive oxygen species production, therefore aging the cells, doing damage to the different structures. And extrinsic would be something like sun, nutrition, water content, things of that nature. So in youthful skin, as we see, there's these huge structures that are holding up the skin. So it's nice and flat. However, when we develop wrinkles, we start to get these invaginations, these grooves that get formed, as you can see in this illustration. Well, when we look at the cube of skin, that's what we see. We see these grooves that are being made. And what is causing that? Well, it's because of the loss of collagen, elastin, and obviously hyaluronic acid. So the big question that we're trying to answer now throughout this video, for the rest of this video, is can we supplement with hyaluronic acid, and will it then reverse this effect, at least part of this effect, so that maybe we can start pushing these structures back up. So the epidermis gets pushed back upwards, and the dermis is then filled back up with its structural proteins. Now, I should note that when we get older, or when we start to have that wrinkling, it's actually the epidermis that loses all of its hyaluronic acid. And the dermis tends to have pretty healthy levels of hyaluronic acid. So I found that really interesting in the review, that there's this huge distinction between the two. So really we would want to fill this region right here, this epidermis, with hyaluronic acid and see if that can plump up the wrinkles and make them less noticeable. Okay, so let's start with injected hyaluronic acid, which is definitely unique. Okay, let's get into this. So this is study 112, and here is our groups. So how they ended up performing this study, which is not exactly great, unfortunately. So they recruited 100 men and women, although 96% of them were women. So the study is heavily slanted towards women. Nothing wrong with that. So the 4 men that were involved probably had almost zero effect on the statistics. The individuals were an average age of 48 years of age. They had moderate skin aging and were otherwise healthy. And that's an assumption because they don't actually show the baseline values of like cholesterol, blood pressure, et cetera, et cetera. Some of the study, none of the studies actually showed any of the baseline values, but some of the studies briefly had a sentence of, oh, they were otherwise healthy. So this is just an assumption. Typically, I would actually show you the data, but in this scenario, we don't have the data. So this is just, as I mentioned, an assumption. They put people into the injected hyaluronic acid condition, where they did these micro injections. And then they had also another condition, which is called an internal control. So an internal control in this scenario is that everybody was exposed to hyaluronic acid. However, they were only exposed on one arm. So one arm was experienced the micro injections of hyaluronic acid. The other arm was exposed to nothing. That's why I've got no treatment, and that's why there's no placebo here. So this is not the best design. Typically what you would want is some sort of placebo, some sort of the same gel maybe that you use for hyaluronic acid without the hyaluronic acid. That would have been ideal in this scenario. So really the participants know that on one arm they're getting some sort of treatment, on the other arm they're getting nothing, so they wouldn't expect anything to happen on the other arm, which leads to a potential placebo effect, which leads to significant potential bias, which is not great for this study. The other thing is that it's randomized, so they didn't have a choice on which arm it would be applied to, the hyaluronic acid. Okay, fair enough, that's good. And it's randomly assigned. So, you know, some people got on their left arm, some people got on their right arm. We don't know. They didn't know. Or they didn't have a choice, I suppose I should say. And it was single blind, meaning that the researchers were blinded to which arm was injected with the hyaluronic acid. However, obviously the participants knew because they were it was only one arm that was treated, and the other arm had nothing to it. And it lasted for this section of the study, which is the only part that I'm going to be focused on, lasted for 12 weeks, so 3 months. So not the greatest design of a study, to be completely honest. I like it. I like having internal controls. That has advantages to it, which is really fantastic. But you need to have a placebo, and then in that scenario, then you can actually have a double-blind experiment if they just merely added the gel without the hyaluronic acid. It's really unfortunate they didn't do that, but they didn't. So here's the results. So one of the results. We're looking at the overall change from the baseline in terms of skin quality. And so the lower the value, then the better the value, according to this scale that they used. So here we've got our untreated arm, and here we've got our treated arm. And I realize it says 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, 12 months, 15 months. We are only focused on this 3-month mark, and I'll tell you why. The reason is because they only did this injection once at the very beginning. So they took assessments before, and then they took assessments and they did the injection, and then they did another assessment 3 months later. And then they did more assessments after the fact, but they did not reapply the injection. They told people, hey, this arm wasn't treated, so would you like a treatment added to that arm as well? So then they did some confuzzling of nothing like unethical. They were just offering people, hey, you had things done on one arm. Would you like this positive treatment to also be applied to your other arm? Some people said yes, so they ended up applying it to the other arm. So it starts to get really murky. So I'm just going to focus on the plain and simple what I've described. One arm is untreated right here, and one arm is treated. So, and then for the other individuals, some people decide not to get treatment and they still had their measurements taken, and other people decide to get treated. And what we find is, according to this scale, that we see a 1 grade improvement, which is pretty substantial improvement in overall skin health, skin elasticity, anti-aging, etc., etc. Not the greatest design, I really gotta say. Okay, so to put this to the test, just look at these images, and I just thought I might as well just test you and see which one you think is a more youthful looking hand. So typically you'd want this to be under the same lighting. It seems like they're relatively similar lighting, maybe a little bit more dim here compared to here. But just looking at the skin quality, which one do you think is the before and which one do you think is the after? And actually comment down below which one you think. So is it the left side? Is it A? Or is it the right side? Is it B? And the answer is, drum roll please, this is the before, and this is after 3 months. So this is the injected hand with the after 3 months exposure. Okay, so let's do it one more time. We have our, so this is a progression. So pick 1, 2, and 3 in terms of what was baseline, what was the midway point, and what was the after intervention. So after the addition of hyaluronic acid. Pick, A, is it B, A, C, is it A, B, C, is it C, B, A, etc., etc. And drum roll, please. This is the before, and this is the after. When I look at it, not to bias your answers, you've already written down your answers, so you can post them in the comments. You post them anywhere, and I think that this certainly looks like it's more thinned out skin, and this is plumper skin, in my opinion. Granted, this could be entirely some sort of internal bias that I have leading to this conclusion. So if you want to discount, if you want to eliminate my interpretation of these images, I do not blame you one bit. But you had your own, but you did not have that bias, just to be clear, because you didn't know the results. So if you ended up getting A, B, and C, and you actually thought C looked better than A, then you have some proof right there. Okay, so that's the first study. That's study 112. Now, let's look at a meta-analysis, which is study 122. And I'm sorry, actually, this is study 114, not 122. 122 is the least biased scientific review that we talked about earlier. Okay, so I wanted to add this meta-analysis, which if you've been following Physionic for a while, you know that I've covered several meta-analyses before, many meta-analyses before, but I wanted to point this out because this one is horrid. I'm not going to be going through it in any sort of depth. I just wanted to point out some of the major issues with this study and why it's extremely important to really dig deep and try to look after what the researchers did to try to trace it back, because sometimes you'll find you get to completely different worlds than what the researchers did. And this is truly a horrible meta-analysis, to put it lightly. Okay, so this is the general systematic review that you've likely seen if you've been part of Physionic for a while. They found 1,034 studies that hit certain search terms, hyaluronic acid, skin, etc., and then ultimately narrowed it down to 14 because they have to exclude many studies because maybe it wasn't long enough, maybe it wasn't the right hyaluronic acid, maybe they use hyaluronic acid plus 5 other ingredients. There are a number of different, many reasons why they would exclude. That's perfectly normal, and they ended up with 14 studies. Then they do a bias assessment, and they find that generally the studies have very little risk of bias. I don't even know if I buy this, to be honest with you. I didn't go through each one of these studies, so this isn't even all the studies. Now, one of the problems here, I can already go ahead and tell you one of the problems is that many of the studies that they included in the bias assessment and in the systematic review were just not included in the reference list. So they just don't exist. As far as I'm concerned, I tried to look up some of these studies. They just don't exist. I'm not saying that they were trying to be disingenuous or anything like that, but what I'm saying is that they may have mistyped many studies. For example, I've got some notes here. So they switched up the names. I think that's what happened because I had to do some real digging. So they'll use Kwon, Kwon, and Hyun, Hyun, but they're different parts of the same name. So, and I think that's what happened. I remember I found a study that had Kwon Hyun all in one name, and they had referenced just one part of the name, Kwon, at one half of the analysis, and then suddenly randomly switched it to Hyun. Please excuse my enunciate. I don't know how to say the names accurately. Hyun for the other half, and just like completely switched it. And then when I tried to find the studies, they didn't exist. So then I found a study that had. I ended up looking for myself for studies with those names and found that there's a researcher that has both of the names. So, I mean, that's a kind of a big deal because that means people can't follow along with what you're talking about. Then the Hugh study, 2017, simply doesn't even exist in the references. So if you go through they don't just have Zhao 2017, they have to actually have the reference in the full reference list, which is 100 studies or 50 studies or whatever it is, and they just don't have this one right here, Hugh 2017. And it's possible I thought that it was possible that they mistyped this for Hyun, which is Hyun, which is what I was talking about earlier. But they include this Hugh study in the analysis comparing control versus treatment. And I'll show you that in just a little bit. They're trying to see, so they're adding this study, and it's supposed to have a control to see if the skin is in favor of the control, or after hyaluronic acid injection, or is it in favor of hyaluronic acid? And after finding a study that fit this description, there is no control in that study. So this should have been excluded. Let's just say that this is the correct study that I found. This should have been excluded. I realize that this might be very confusing because if you don't know anything about meta-analyses, I'm just saying that there's huge discrepancies, and I would not use this meta-analysis for anything. So I'm just including it just to show that there is some trash out there, and we have to be super careful about just opening a study and just saying, look, they found this result. Because often I shouldn't say often, sometimes on a minority of cases, you will find really bad stuff. I've got another note here. The June study, so 2017, et al. Is not in the reference list either. So not only is the Hughes study, and this could apply to many of these other studies, I just stopped looking after a while. The only reference with June is the middle author in the Hughes study. So this is the only study that had a person named June in the study. And again, the study has no control. So let me explain that. So in a meta-analysis, you're looking for what is favoring, if the injection is favoring the experiment, so the addition of hyaluronic acid, which is the experimental intervention, or is it favoring the control, which is presumably the placebo or the control where they don't have the injection. And wherever this total diamond leans towards, and this also applies here, but I'm just focused on this total diamond, wherever that leans, it leans more in favor of one or the other. But for us to have a comparison of the control versus the experimental, you have to have a control. You can't compare something against itself or nothing. And for these studies that I was describing, this Hughes study and this June study, they don't have a control. On top of that, this is not actually a control. What they're comparing is what's known as a monophasic versus biphasic implementation of hyaluronic acid. So what does that mean? It means that there's these different types of treatments that you can get for injections of hyaluronic acid. One of them is monophasic, one of them is biphasic, meaning I think it's two treatments versus one treatment. So mono is obviously one, bi is obviously two, and nowhere in their analysis do they tell you if the experimental side over here is the monophasic or the biphasic. So I had to kind of just piece it together using clues from what they were talking about. And so I wrote here that it's guesswork on my part. So the monophasic is the control, and the experimental is called the biphasic treatment, so the double treatment. And it seems like everything indicates more that the single exposure is more beneficial towards improving skin rejuvenation and whatnot. Not that, of course, I buy any of this stuff because of all the reasons that I mentioned. Now, another thing is, I'm telling you, there's just so much. There's so much. And I stopped after a while. I was just like, this is so bad. Another thing is that they mentioned that they used a fixed effects model. I'm not going to go into exactly what that is, but typically when you have high levels of heterogeneity, meaning you have a lot of variability between studies. So let's say study 1 comes to the conclusion hyaluronic acid is very effective. The study 2 indicates that it's not effective at all. Study 3 finds that it's a little effective, but not as effective as study 1. You see my point? Like there's a lot of disparate values. So you're getting results all over the place. And a meta-analysis can control for that by using what's known as a random effects model. However, they indicate that they used a fixed effects model. A fixed effects model generally assumes that the studies are generally in the same, like leading towards the overall same conclusion with an effect within a certain range of one another. And so they're using a fixed effects model, but here, this measure right here, which is called a heterogeneity test, they find there's 78% heterogeneity, which isn't shocking because you have a study that's over here, you have a study that's over here, and you have a study that's over here. And yet they're indicating that they used a fixed effects model, which is inappropriate for this type of analysis. So in the written section, however, they mention that they use a random effects model. So, but here they have written that they're using a fixed effects model. I just cannot express enough how bad this is. So I just, for one last thing, do not take anything from this meta-analysis. Nothing. Okay. So in terms of injectable hyaluronic acid, the studies are horrible. I only had 2, and there are certainly others out there, but from the 2 that we've investigated here, injectable hyaluronic acid might help a little bit. It might help, I would say, with the largest amount of caution I can possibly have to say that yes, it does help. But do I feel confident about that? My confidence is at a 0. Okay, after all that, let's discuss topical hyaluronic acid. This first study is study 109. So how did they go about this? They had 40 women, so they recruited 40 women that were between 46 and 47 years of age, mild to moderate skin aging, were otherwise healthy. Again, that assumption that I was talking about earlier, it's not necessarily confirmed. And this is a parallel design experiment. This is certainly much better than the injectable study that we talked about, study 112. I believe that was the right one. It's parallel design, meaning that they split these 40 women into one group applying topical, so skin based, so adding it to the skin, just a serum or a gel to the skin, topical hyaluronic acid, and the other group also applied a gel or a serum, but it did not contain hyaluronic acid. So it's the same gel without the active ingredient, which is the perfect type of placebo. You cannot get better than that. So kudos to them, really fantastic. They were also randomized, meaning that they were randomly assigned to either group. They were also double blind, meaning the researchers didn't know which group people were in, and the participants didn't know which group that they were in. So they didn't know if they were applying hyaluronic acid or if they were applying the placebo. And the study ran for 4 weeks. This so far is great. No problem whatsoever. Then I've just got these indications on the different sites of measurement. So they're looking at different distances. So the amount of tucking essentially of the skin. So is the skin sagging, or is the skin starting to pull together a little bit more? That's kind of a rough translation of what I'm talking about here. We've got our times 7. So after 7 days, 14 days, and 30 days. And the lower it is, that means that the more shrinking you have of the skin sagging. So in this case, in this particular situation, in this one, you want things to widen out. So you want things to loosen up a little bit. So in this situation, in this measure, the higher it is, the better. In this measure, the lower it is, the better, just to be 100% clear. Okay, so when we look at the comparisons between the two, here we've got our placebo condition, here we've got our active or our treatment condition, our hyaluronic acid at 7 days, 14 days, and 30 days. And what we see is already at 7 days, we start to see these effects where it's starting to improve the skin. And then it has an even greater effect after 14 days and a little bit greater effect after 30 days. The placebo, however, no effect whatsoever, which is obviously what a placebo should do. And the same is true for this other measure as well. Okay, great. Looking at the lips specifically, so lip volume at 0. So this is where they actually screwed up. And this is, again, this is another situation where I just wish that I could believe everything that they're saying, because they don't pay attention to detail. What they did here, which is a mistake, is they've got time 0, they've got time 3 hours, and then 7 days, 14 days, and 30 days. So the time is hours and days. So hours is 3 hours later, and then after administration, and then 7 hours later. That's all fine. But in the next slide, you're going to see why I have a problem with this. So let's just take it as it is. So this is to look at the lip plumpness, the size of the lips. So instead of being thinned out, the skin being thinned out, and remember hyaluronic acid plumps up skin in general because it attracts so much water. We see that after 3 hours already, we start to see an effect. And after 7 days, we certainly see an effect. 14 days, we see an effect. And 30 days, we see an effect. But we don't see much improvement, maybe a slight improvement after 14 and 30 days over the initial improvements. So this would imply that the effects are extremely quick. Okay, fine. Now, looking at wrinkle depth and wrinkle volume, so the amount of wrinkles and the actual depth of the wrinkles. Remember, hyaluronic acid should push the skin back upwards because it starts to plump up the skin. Now, here is where they made a mistake. You see, here they've got hours and days, but they don't have the hour time period that they had here. Time 3 hours, 7 days, 14 days, 30 days. Here they've got time 0, so baseline, fine. But then they don't have the 3 hour, but they just ported it over from their previous figure. So they just ported this over here and then didn't pay attention. And when you look at the legend, the actual figure legend, to actually look at so they'll say like figure 6, nose to cheekbones, contour distance, the plumping effect, variation during treatment. It just gives you a description of what you're looking at. I've just eliminated it because it just crowds the space, and I'm usually just describing things anywhere. You can tell that they, again, just copied from this previous figure, which has the hours, and pasted it under this one, and every single other one. And yet, these conditions don't have hour measures. It's not like a deal breaker, but it's just lazy. It's like as if you didn't read your own study after you finish it. Like you just stitched it all together and then you're like, all right, good enough. No editing whatsoever. Just send it out. To me, it just doesn't scream confidence to me. That's just me. Okay. It's a small thing, but I think it matters a little bit. Okay, so anyway, wrinkle depth, wrinkle volume, they all improve 7 days later, 14 days later, 30 days later. You see that wrinkle volume decreases. Obviously doesn't go to nothing, but it does decrease pretty substantially compared to the placebo, which is in green. The yellow is the hyaluronic acid. And then wrinkle depth decreases substantially over that time as well. So it doesn't seem to decrease much, although they show that it's statistically significant, which is really weird because if I look at that, I mean, it's certainly statistically significant maybe compared to the baseline, but I don't see how it would be significant versus the placebo. I don't know if I buy that, but we have to take it for what it is. So with some added doubt thrown into this study, there seems to be a decreasing in wrinkle depth over time. So that's great to see. So this study, with its quirks, indicates that hyaluronic acid is effective at reducing wrinkles. And just for full transparency, there's a bunch of other measures. It's just a bunch of other areas of the body where they do wrinkle measurements, wrinkle volume, wrinkle depth, elasticity, things like that. I didn't feel like they just all follow the same trend. So I'm not going to show you that data, but they have, maybe 4 other figures, as well as a few tables that indicate the exact same thing, just for full transparency. But they all follow the same trend as this. Hey, before we continue, wouldn't it be nice to have a pocket researcher, somebody that you can turn to and ask questions when it comes to buying certain items, certain supplements, things of that nature, and be a general benefit to your health? Well, that's what the Physionic Insiders is for. So, for example, take this topic, hyaluronic acid. So the video that you're watching right now is the public version. So it doesn't have all the information that you would normally have access to for the Physionic Insider program. Therein, you'll get a shortened summary so that you can just pick through whatever's important, as well as you'll get access to how to implement hyaluronic acid, how much to take, as well as different formulations of hyaluronic acid. I've done research on all that stuff, but it's not available in this public version. So if you're interested in having access to all that, as well as all the other full study analyses where I do more summaries and do more of this kind of implementation and application, then you should join the Physionic Insiders. That's where all the good stuff is, as well as greater access to me. Oh, and just as a sweetener, I just want to also point out that there are these shortened written research reviews, which take maybe 5 minutes to read, 10 minutes to read, and I've got many of them. And one of them is on hyaluronic acid, you guessed it, or this other one that's on an anti-aging supplement. So if you're interested, certainly consider joining the Physionic Insiders. I think it'll make your life a lot easier. This is study 116. You're seeing a lot of red. That's usually not a good sign. So in this study, they do not have a control group. As you can see, this is repeated measure, meaning that they just have one group of 40 women, ages 30 to 65 years of age, and they were otherwise healthy. Again, an assumption. And then they applied topical hyaluronic acid, and they also applied, which is just, again, the weirdest thing, they also applied sunscreen. So sunscreen plus hyaluronic acid. There's already a confounding variable with the sunscreen, unfortunately, but we're going to take it for what it is. They didn't mention anything about randomization, so I just said no randomization. I just have written here no info on randomization. There was no blinding, so the researchers knew what they were taking. The women knew exactly what they were taking. And there's obviously no placebo group if there's no parallel design. Or if there's no crossover design. It's just a repeated measure. So you take measurements at baseline, and then you apply the hyaluronic acid for, in this case, 6 weeks every day. And then at the end, you end up with, boom, you end up with results. So you take another measurement and then you compare against baseline. So the only comparison we're going to get at this point is against baseline. Pre versus post. That's it. Yes. I remember this. This is the only piece of data I'm going to be showing you. I think it's the only one that they have some other data as well. This is so egregiously horrid. I'm just realizing how much I've been blasting these studies, but it's so true. I even mentioned this on the Physionic community. I made a small post about it. So if you're in the Physionic community, you know the free version, you know that I've talked about this already and actually used this very same diagram. I remember this being the dermatologist. So they had a dermatologist researcher that did assessments on skin. So that's how we're getting this data. So this is % improvement from baseline. So immediately after adding hyaluronic acid, the dermatologist researcher tried to determine if there was an added plumping or hydration effect. And then 2 weeks later, then 4 weeks later, then 6 weeks later. I just want you to think about that. I just want you to think about applying hyaluronic acid to the skin, then the researcher just, as he's watching you, just put hyaluronic acid on your skin. Then he looks at it, he's like, yeah, looks better. In what world? In what world is that acceptable? How is that in any way unbiased? And the answer is it's not. It's not at all. It's the highest level of bias you could possibly have. An immediate measurement. Then 2 weeks later, again, these participants know where they're applying hyaluronic acid, and the researchers know that every person that they see has had hyaluronic acid applied to them. So they could potentially, I'm not necessarily saying that this is the case, but they could potentially just say, oh yeah, looks better, good to go. Oh, 4 weeks later, yep, even better. Yep, 6 weeks later, even better, because you're seeing 64% improvement, 49% improvement, 35% improvement, just a stepwise improvement. I'm not saying that's necessarily the bias is the reason for this improvement, but I can't exclude it, and I wouldn't exclude it. This is just unbelievably biased. This is horrid. This is the worst possible design of a study. I was just incredulous. So this is crap. This is absolute crap. Unmitigated crap. Okay, I'm going to stop ranting about this. This is just so bad. So another really bad study. This might be the worst study of them all. Other than, yeah, maybe. We'll see. Okay, the next one is study 121. And a bunch of red. Not great news. Again, here we're looking at so they used topical hyaluronic acid, but they also used a peptide cream, which supports collagen production. And it was 17 women, 45 to 65 years of age, otherwise healthy. Again, that's just an assumption. No information on randomization, no blinding whatsoever. So the participants and the researchers knew what everybody was taking, and no placebo, obviously, because it's a repeated measure, just like the last one. And it lasted for 12 weeks. So I'm going to show you a few pieces of data here, and we'll start with this. So what we're looking at here is a subset of the participants that they like marked a particular piece of their skin, with like a marker, it was a temporary tattoo. That's what it was. Pointing out a temporary tattoo, and the researchers just say, apply hyaluronic acid or this serum with the peptides technically to this region multiple times, okay, over the 12 weeks. And then we're going to measure that area, this specific area again. So they're looking at, they're using ultrasound to measure the skin overall, like thickness and health. And this is at baseline. So I've got this measure here. We've got our epidermis here. We've got our dermis here. We've got our hypodermis over here. And here we've got our line, which indicates this kind of top section up here. And then we've got our dermis here. And we're trying to see if there's any added thickness. So just from this single image, we're supposed to then believe, with no quantification of anything, just use your eyes and be able to tell if there's an added level of thickness. Sure, I guess to me, I would argue, yes, there is an added level of thickness here compared to here. Again, you can completely throw that out the window if you'd like. So just ask yourself, do you think that this is a little bit thicker than this? And if that's the case, then it had its desired effect. Okay, another test. Which one is the before? Which one is the after? I'll give you 3 seconds. 3, 2, 1. And drum roll, please. I tricked you this time. I didn't put it on the left side. So this is the baseline, and this is the after 12 weeks. Do you notice a difference in the wrinkling? Now, what I'll have you notice here is that if this is the same person, which I assume that it is, it seems like the lighting is very different in this scenario compared to this scenario. This is a very yellow light, and this is a very dark, kind of a whitish light by comparison. This is not the way that you're supposed to be doing things. Again, another study that it shows a little bit of evidence, but it's just so shoddy. I've got one study so far out of the 3. One study was just horrid. This study was pretty bad, and the other study was okay, but not that great either because of some of the problems that I mentioned in that as well, even if the design was excellent. So overall, topical hyaluronic acid seems to be effective based off of this limited, extremely limited data. My confidence is low. It's not 0, but it's low. Finally, oral hyaluronic acid. Okay, so now we're going to be looking at study 110. Study 110 is very well designed. Not quite as well as the other one, but it's very well designed regardless. I'll explain why. So they had 40 men and women. So this is an actual study that incorporated a decent amount of men and women. So it wasn't 96% women. Again, nothing wrong with that. It's just that there's probably more applicability to women in those scenarios. Do I think that there's still applicability to men? Yes, but then it's just speculation on my part. I don't actually have evidence for that. So 40 men and women, 43 to 44 years of age, and otherwise generally considered healthy. That is, again, an assumption. They had some of the participants go into the hyaluronic acid condition, and they had other participants in the placebo condition. Now, the placebo condition consumed dextrin as opposed to hyaluronic acid, which is not quite as good as the topical study, which used the same exact gel. It would have been nice if they've just added hyaluronic acid plus a little bit of sugar or a little bit of just something really benign, and then in like a pill form or whatever it might be, and then had that inactive ingredient as the placebo instead of having dextrin. Because as far as I'm aware, the hyaluronic acid condition did not consume any dextrin with their hyaluronic acid. And this was a randomized study. This was double-blind, and it did last for 12 weeks. All very good. Now, in measures of hydration, this is not a anime-style embarrassed symbol. It's just a sign of hydration, my best attempt at it. And so we're looking at two different measures of hydration. So we're looking at the face, the arms, and the waist. I'm going to focus on the face just because there's a lot of data to get through. And ultimately, we're comparing week 0 versus week 4, 8, and 12. And then we're going to compare the HA, so hyaluronic acid condition, versus placebo. So at baseline, they're roughly the same. They're the mean, so we're looking at 49.5 is the mean or the average result of hydration for the hyaluronic acid condition before they started using hyaluronic acid. Then the placebo, obviously before they started using placebo, not that it should matter though. So they're roughly in the same ballpark, 49.5, 49.1. Okay, great. And there's no statistical difference between the two. Great, that's fine. Then it starts to creep upwards. Hydration starts to creep upwards for the hyaluronic acid condition. But it is not statistically significant. Still, 4 weeks later. Then, 8 weeks later, we start to see that it is statistically significant. And then after 12 weeks, we definitely see it as statistically significant, not just against the baseline, but against the placebo as well. So 2 statistical analyses indicate that there is an improvement in hydration with the consumption of hyaluronic acid. And that's true also for the arms and the waist, but it's a little bit less. So there's only one significant value. So only one statistical analysis indicates a difference, but that's still good enough. Then by this measure, which is another measure of the same thing, we also see that confirmed. So 2 different measures, 2 experiments. That's great. I mean, hey, kudos to them. They did very well here. Okay, so here we've got a list of different things. I've got a small, because even I couldn't remember this. There's these categorical systems that dermatologists use, or dermatological researchers use, and these lists then inform on the firmness, the elasticity, the ability to return back to its original state. So let's say you pull on your skin and then, it being able to return right back to where it was. They use these different measurement techniques to figure that out. I don't know all of them, so I'm certainly not an expert in this. Somebody who's a dermatologist could speak to this better than I could, but I did want to list what they were here because here are the evaluations. So R0, R1, R2, R7, etc., and they just repeat. So this is at different sites, the forehead, so 4 for the forehead, 4 for the arm, and 4 for the waist. So I'm going to focus on the forehead again. I'm just focused more on the face to get us to be a little cuter. So we've got hyaluronic acid up top, placebo on the bottom. We've got our week 0, week 4, week 8, and week 12. Fair enough. R0, firmness of skin. The firmness of the skin was improved with hyaluronic acid compared against baseline and against placebo with no changes in the placebo. Fantastic. R1, skin's ability to return to original state after perturbation. There does not seem to be an improvement in this. And in overall elasticity, there seems to be a slight improvement, and then it seems to go away. So elasticity is improved for a small while, and then it returns back up to near its basal state. I'm not entirely sure why that would be the case. And that's also measured by this other this other measure of elasticity also found the same thing. So there's a slight improvement in this situation, and then it starts to rebound back upwards. Not completely, but slightly. So I can't explain that, but generally we see a little bit of an improvement with the use of hyaluronic acid. Okay, great. Now, that's not necessarily the case for all these other conditions. There seems to be better performance, especially around the waist, when looking at elasticity. There is an improvement in elasticity with the waist measurement, at least with this elasticity measurement. What's interesting here is that the placebo actually also decreases in its measures, but that may be, some of these effects may be because of, I'm just spitballing here, but it's possible that the researcher that conducted the tests, that did the experiments, may have been different from one experiment to the other, which would lead to inter-experimental variability. So you'd have one researcher that does it at week 0 and at week 4, and then you have a different one that does it at week 8. Maybe they do it slightly differently. So typically you want the researcher to remain the same so that you know that it's always consistent. But I don't know if that's the case. Maybe they did use the same researcher and something else is going on that I can't explain. And then I wanted to to show the actual images. So another thing that hyaluronic acid does is it actually promotes the production of collagen by our fibroblasts, which is something I did mention in the physiology section, but I wanted to add here as well. So if we're comparing the placebo versus the hyaluronic acid, really we're comparing within. So 0 weeks versus 12 weeks. To me, it seems like there's a slight improvement in wrinkling after 12 weeks, but it's with the placebo, and we don't see a change in collagen intensity. With the hyaluronic acid, I do see an improvement as well. Again, it could just be my eyes, which I'm wearing glasses, so maybe I'm blind. There's wrinkling here, and then the same wrinkles seem to be less deep. They seem to be much shallower after 12 weeks, and the collagen synthesis is increased. With the placebo, maybe there's a difference here, but the collagen, there does not seem to be a change. And here, I really can't tell much of a difference. Maybe a little bit lighter, a little bit shallower in the hyaluronic acid condition, and there is a little bit increased collagen, but not a whole lot. Then the placebo doesn't seem to be much change at all, and the collagen synthesis is the exact same. And in this situation, I don't know, maybe it just seems like the lighting has changed to me. It doesn't actually, I don't actually see that much change in the actual wrinkling. But the intensity of collagen has increased after the 12 weeks. So you make of that as you will, but it seems like at least on the collagen front that there seems to be an increase in collagen production. So overall, this study was not bad definitely by comparison to many of the other studies that we've looked at. Now, moving on to study 111. They recruited 60 women, 54 to 55 years of age, mild to moderate skin aging, otherwise healthy. That's the assumption. This was randomized. It was double-blind. It was 4 weeks long, and they separated them through a parallel design. So they had one group consume oral hyaluronic acid, and the other one was placebo, consuming maltodextrin, which again isn't perfectly ideal, but it's probably not going to make much of a difference. So pretty well designed. Here we've got the two images, so two people's crow's feet that they measured. So we're comparing here this image versus this image and this image versus this image. So yellow is raised skin. So typically that's what you would want. You want more yellow, and you want at least more blue turning into more of the greens and the reds and the oranges and the yellows. So it's like blue, which is the greatest wrinkling. So the greatest level of depth or like invaginations in the skin. Then you have something like green, then you would have like an orangish red, brownish orangish red, and then you have yellow, which is the highest, which is the best. And if we compare this to this, they're pointing out the specific points where they think that there's some improvement. So these are, you know, you're taking images like of just a specific region and trying to replicate it. It does seem like there's less yellow actually in this condition. So this is after the consumption of hyaluronic acid. But to their credit, I will say that I do think that there seems to be a little bit less of the blue regions in this image compared to this image. So it seems like, if you want to think of it like a lake almost, it does look like it, that you have greater lakes here, and here we're looking at western United States with low water levels, which is unfortunate, but in this situation it's a good thing. So this seems like, again, you can totally tell me that I'm way off base, and the effects are certainly subtle, no doubt about that. So you make your own assessments. Here we do see that there's a lot more blue compared to here. So these areas have closed up some, so the skin has raised some a little bit, and you have a little bit more of this red over here. And the yellow doesn't seem to have changed a whole lot, maybe a little bit more intense, but doesn't seem to be as widespread. So, I mean, the effects are really mild when you're looking at the crow's feet of these two individuals. I mean, is this like profound data? No, it isn't. Then looking at wrinkle depth, this is not how I would display data, mainly because I would want to actually see standard deviations. I would want to see standard error of the mean, but they're looking at percentages here. This is versus the control versus the baseline. So here we've got a placebo. Placebo doesn't change, and the hyaluronic acid does seem to drop the wrinkles, the wrinkle depth, and it seems to increase wrinkle or skin firmness. And this is by comparison against the baseline and against the placebo. And this is also the case in this situation, although the placebo also drives some of the effect because it seems to get much worse with skin elasticity specifically. So this study indicates that hyaluronic acid, oral hyaluronic acid, is helpful, although I would say that the effects, at least by the crow's feet measures, are extremely subtle. And these measures seem to be pretty profound, almost 20% changes, or in this situation, about 5% betterment. 5% is pretty subtle, but 20% is pretty substantial when you're talking about wrinkle depth and wrinkle volume. Okay, looking at 113. All right, to look at study 113. So how did they go about this? This is, again, one of those repeated measure designs. So where they're measuring at baseline and then measuring after, in this case, 4 weeks of consuming hyaluronic acid. So there's no randomization, no blinding. So everybody knows what they're consuming, obviously, because there's no control group. And there's no placebo, obviously, because there's no control group. And it was 20 women, 45 to 60 years of age, that were otherwise healthy, or that's the assumption. So not the greatest study design off the bat. Here we've got our hydration levels. which this is all in German, aber ich kann Deutsch sprechen, also werde ich mein Deutsch benutzen. Okay, so because I can speak German, I could read this. So vorher is before, and 20 Tage, 20 Tage, 20 Tage, 40 Tage, so 40 days, 20 days. And vorher, so before, they had this effect on hydration, so this is the baseline measure, and then it improved. These are box and whisker plots, so you're essentially looking at this middle line, this median line, which moves upwards, and seems to improve after 20 days and doesn't seem to further improve after 40 days. Then looking at the elasticity, again, vorher, so before, so the baseline, 20 days, 40 days, it seems like there's a slight improvement after 20 days and maybe even a slightly greater improvement after 40 days. And then looking at the wrinkles, the amount of wrinkles, we see that before it's pretty high, and then it decreases and decreases a little bit more after 40 days. So this, I mean, it's tough to say. This isn't exactly great data because of the study design. This could easily have been, this could easily be driven by just bias the entire way. So I don't put a whole lot of stock in this study. But with all of that said, let's get to our conclusions here. Topical, oral, and injection of hyaluronic acid improves skin youthfulness. Fewer wrinkles, shallower wrinkles, greater elasticity, better hydration, according to all the studies. But the big caveat here, and if you didn't listen to me on any of the study analysis, you missed out on some good ones. The studies tend to be really poor. Not all of them, but a lot of them are really poor in design, however. So my confidence level is highest in oral hyaluronic acid. It's second highest in topical, and it's third highest in injection. The injection studies were all horrible. Topical, most of them were horrible. And oral, there were maybe one or two that were decent and one that was not that great. So that's the conclusion up to now. Now, for the Physionic insiders that are going to be continuing on for this full analysis, we're also going to be going over optimal dosages and implementation, as well as adding one more study, study 120, for larger versus smaller molecular weight formulations. Which formulations should we focus on? If we're going to be using oral or topical or injection, I'm going to be focused on oral and topical. That can be very effective for our skin. Hopefully you learned something, and hopefully you got something out of this. I know that there was a lot of ranting, a lot of frustrations and whatnot, but that's where we are with industry-funded studies, and that's where we are with studies on skin health. A lot of research is not going to be done on skin unless it's paid by industry, unfortunately. So hopefully you learned something regardless, and I'll hope to speak with you in the near future. Have a good one. Bye.